This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Tim Bird. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode I talk with Tim Bird. His new book, The Great North Wood, has just been released by Avery Hill Publishing, and I talk with Tim about the new book and his unique style of storytelling based largely on space and geographic location. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by those great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes at 50% off. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And head on over to DCB Service right now, and you can find unbelievable savings on a variety of comics for the month of September. In fact, since today I'm talking with an Avery Hill creator, if you check out DCB Service this month, you can find two of their upcoming publications at great discounts. You can get Katrina Chapman's Follow Me In at 25% off of the cover price. And you can also find Christina Bagzinski's Retrograde Orbit at a 25% discount as well. And as we've mentioned on the Comics Alternative many times in the past, Avery Hill puts out a lot of great material, so you can't go wrong with them. All of this just goes to show that you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to DCB Service right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. The Great North Wood, which was released the first of this month, is Tim Bird's longest work to date. It's the story, or perhaps a better way of putting it would be that it's a history or a meditation, of an area in South London known for its wooded past. This includes areas such as Norwood, Gipsy Hill, Honor Oak, and Sydenham Hill Woods. In fact, as Tim mentions in our conversation, Sydenham Hill Woods is really the last vestige of the heavily forested area south of London, and it's where Tim and his family currently reside. What makes the Great North Wood stand out is Tim Bird's use of geographic space to tell his story. As we discuss over the course of our interview, character is at a minimum in Tim's work, and he uses location and space to carry his narrative. What's more, the creator often underscores the mystery and magic that has traditionally been a part of Britain's wooded areas. Much of my conversation with Tim centers on the new book, but we also talk about his previous comics, such as the various works in his Grey Areaseries, also published by Avery Hill. These are also largely based on location and geographic space, and Tim goes into detail about his evolution as an artist, working through his Grey Areacomics to get to a place where he can more fully explore his surroundings in his latest book. Tim and I had a fruitful conversation, and let's listen to that interview now. I'm talking with Tim Bird. He is the author of The Great North Wood, a book that just recently came out from Avery Hill Publishing. Tim, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Hi, Derek. Thanks for asking me on the show.
Oh, certainly. This is something that I've been looking forward to for a while. I know that Kat at Avery Hill got in touch with us about The Great North Wood, and we had considered discussing it on a regular review show that we do weekly. But I thought maybe a better way of approaching your new book would be to actually talk with you, so I appreciate you taking the time to do so.
That's all right. Yeah. Nice to chat.
Yeah, so I guess a good place to begin, and you can consider this the canned question of the interview. To the uninitiated, how would you describe the Great North Wood?
It's a book about the history of an area of London, which is the simple answer. But to expand on that a bit more, it's about a forest that once covered an area of South London. And in fact, a long time ago, most of England was covered in forest. But over time, the forest got cut down for industry and agriculture, and as the population of the country increased. And so what was left was this area called the Great North Wood, it's actually south of London, confusingly. And so my book is about that area of forest, and sort of how the forest lives on in suburban London. There are still some small patches of woodland that you can see, but also it's kind of the idea that the magic of the woodland still exists in suburban streets, and the kind of spirits of the forest perhaps still walk amongst South London streets and things. And so the book has kind of short stories, I guess, or chapters, and they're about different characters that maybe lived in the woods, or characters that definitely did and have entered folklore. And there are folk tales about various characters like gypsies and outlaws that lived in the woods, and also a bit about kind of more magical ideas of spirits and elves and woodland mythical creatures that inhabited this area maybe at one point.
Mm-hmm. And you and your family reside in South London, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So we live in a place called Sydenham, which is just next to Sydenham Hill Woods, which is the largest part of the Great North Wood that still remains intact.
Yeah, I'm looking at the very first page of the Great North Wood, where you provide one of the places in the text where you provide a map. And so I have a sense of location here. And I have to tell you, that really helped, your inclusion of 2 or 3 maps in the Great North Wood, because I'm an American. I am not familiar with regions of the UK, specifically London. So that helped to give me a sense of place and where you were going in the Great North Wood. And that leads me to another question, and that is, I get the sense from reading both the Great North Wood, some of your contributions in the anthology Read, which I want to ask you about later, as well as your Grey Areaseries. You seem to be, how do I put this? Definitely a British writer, okay? Someone who is defined, or at least whose work is defined primarily by space, location, geography in the UK. What do you think that, let's say, non-UK readers would be able to get from the Great North Wood? I mean, I personally think you've gone a long way in terms of literally and figuratively mapping out where you're discussing what you're focusing on. But as you were writing not only the Great North Wood, but also your Grey Areaseries, which we can talk about as well, what were you thinking about in terms of, let's say, potentially a non-UK audience?
Yeah, so I did worry that perhaps people who didn't know the area would kind of not get it, and which is why I put maps and things in the book, so you do know where I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think there's stuff in there that kind of is quite universal as well. So everyone kind of knows forests and how they can be quite magical places. So I've thought about that kind of out of the context of it being in a specific location. But then when I have been specific about locations, I've tried to explain everything to an extent where, if you don't know London, or you don't know these really specific parts of London, you can still understand what I'm trying to talk about, really. So I didn't want it to end up like a textbook, though. It's the other thing. So I didn't want it to just be a list of facts and saying, this is where this happened, and then draw a little map. And I wanted it to flow more as a overall comic. So it's it's trying to get the balance between it being accessible to anyone who doesn't know the area, but also being quite specific about these places. And I guess I did want to write it mostly for people who do know the area as well. So there's that side of it.
Mm-hmm. And, what you say about a kind of universality when it comes to understanding wooded area or forests really makes sense to me. And one of the things that struck me about the Great North Wood is you keep coming back again and again to the magic and mystery that is in many ways embedded in the Great North Wood, as people have historically understood it. And we have mentionings of magic and mystery. And when you talk about magic in your art, you have little circles or swirly images that do suggest something a little out of the ordinary. And I really appreciated that. But we also get this sense of magic and mystery in the Gipsy Hill chapter of the book.
So that's a real real character who really lived in Gipsy Hill, which is this area of South London. But yeah, there's the sort of the magic in the folk tales, I guess, the way stories have been written and passed down through generations, and the idea that maybe that does still exist in South London and in Gipsy Hill. There's the way the place maybe has kind of memories of these events and things.
So Margaret Finch, Queen of the Gypsies, was an actual historical figure?
Yeah.
Who lived to over 100?
She did, yeah, and is buried in a church nearby. And the story goes that she was sitting in this crouched position for so long, reading people's fortunes, that she had to be buried in a square coffin, like in her crouched position.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting, as you were talking about what the forest might mean in terms of mystery, magic, and potentially the supernatural, right? The myths, various figures. How different that is, at least in some ways, to the way that wooded areas or forests have been historically viewed in the United States. And I think much of this comes from, let's say, our Puritan heritage. I know that many of the Puritans thought of the woods as a place of potential evil, a place where people went to do things that were rather nefarious. And then later on, when we were dealing with issues of the frontier, and especially when we had writers like James Fenimore Cooper writing about the frontier. I mean, the forest is a dangerous place, right? Because that's where the Native American population hid out and would attack. But also it's where, and you even mentioned this earlier, where robbers and other nefarious individuals would find refuge. And so maybe this is much too broad of a statement to make, but I'm going to say it anyhow. I get the sense that wooded areas in your book, The Great North Wood, seem to be a little more positive and uplifting and have some kind of potential more than, at least historically speaking, forests have been seen in the United States. Again, historically, just because of our past history and how wooded areas have been seen in as rather dark and negative places.
That's a really interesting contrast. I think in the UK, perhaps woods and forests have been kind of romanticized, and they're the settings of quite romantic or quite positive stories. There are definitely folk tales of people being lost in the woods and evil things happening, but also you get folk tales like Robin Hood and things where it's the outlaws are seen as quite the good guys really,
Mm-hmm.
and the guys in the woods that are hiding out from the evil landlords and things in the towns. So that's an interesting contrast with how US stories kind of portray it in a more sinister light. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and I like the way you put it. The history of wooded areas in the UK have a more romanticized feel to them. And I don't know if we really get to that point in the United States until we get, let's say, into the 19th century. And I can think of various writers like Thoreau, for instance, who did bring a more, if you want to call it, romantic view of, a non-civilized area, the woods, the forest, in a way that was rather alien to earlier American writers and just American explorers in general. So I think it's an interesting contrast. Now, another thing that strikes me about the Great North Wood is the fact that now you mentioned that there are certain characters like Margaret Finch, and then we have Ted Righteous, who are rather prominent in certain chapters of the book. But for the most part, I would say that the Great North Wood, and I would go on to include, to some degree, your Grey Areaseries in this as well. We have less character and more geography or location. In other words, one of the amazing things about your comics is that you're able to carry a story primarily through space, location, geography, and only every now and again bring in character. But again, character is relatively sparse in your stories, but it seems all based on space.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear you say that, because that's definitely how I'm trying to write these comics. And yeah, landscape and stuff is definitely what interests me a lot. And I think a lot of probably like my influences in terms of what inspires me to write comics and things are a lot of films really, and I enjoy quite quiet films where there's long shots of landscapes and things like that. So maybe where the characters take a backseat a bit. So it's that kind of thing that's fed into my comics. So I try and write. I normally always write about a specific area. So in this one, it's the Great North Wood. And then one of my previous comics was called From the City to the Sea. And that was about an area of east of London called the Thames Estuary. And so I always start off with an area in mind and write about that, and then kind of fit characters in where I can. But yeah, definitely the main focus is the area and the place and the geography of the place, and trying to capture a spirit of the landscape and things.
You've mentioned From the City to the Sea. We should mention that, the Great North Wood is published by Avery Hill Publishing, but you've been with Avery Hill for a while, and in some of the other texts that you've published through them, Infrastructure, Grey Area While the City Sleeps, and then Grey Area, The Old Straight Track. Now, those three, I believe now are out of print, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. But still in print are, in addition to the Great North Wood, Grey Area From the City to the Sea that you just mentioned, and also Grey Area Our Town. So, I have read Our Town and From the City to the Sea. Haven't been able to get my hands on those other three. Could you explain a little bit about what the straight track, the old straight track, While the City Sleeps, and Infrastructure were all about? Is it similar in terms of being geographically based?
Yes, they all were. Infrastructure was perhaps the most different. It was just a very short book, and illustrations of London infrastructure, so train stations and motorway crossings and things, which sound quite boring. But so it was a full-page illustration, and then on the facing page, just a short paragraph of text, which was sort of a whimsical. I can't really remember any, and I don't have the book to hand, unfortunately. But kind of just a whimsical paragraph about how these places made me feel. But it was all based on London infrastructure. So, and that came out of quite a few years ago now. I can't remember when. But the other two were part of the Grey Area series. The first one was called While the City Sleeps, which was about London at night. So there was little stories about like London nightlife and people working night shifts in London, and just the sort of kind of the unseen part of the city, I suppose. And that was the first book, in fact, that I did with Avery Hill. And then the next one, the Old Straight Track, was a comic about the English motorway system. So back to doing a comic about roads. And the name, the Old Straight Track, came from an Alfred Watkins book where he proposed his theory of ley lines. So these kind of mythical or mystical points across the country that he kind of joined up with imaginary lines, and he felt this energy when he was passing along these imagined lines across the country. And so in this book, The Old Straight Track, my comic, I kind of imagined the motorways as modern ley lines with magical powers joining up towns and cities in England. And that came out through Avery Hill Publishing probably 4 or 5 years ago. And yeah, that's out of print now.
So, okay, let's talk a bit about your Grey Area series, because I'm curious. You're doing something, again, somewhat similar to what you're doing in the new book, The Great North Wood, in that you're exploring not only, let's say, British, specifically South London character through geographic location, with I guess a minimum of character. But what was the origins of your Grey Area series? How did you come up with this idea? What are the goals of that series? Because each of these stories that you had mentioned, Our Town, From City to Sea, Old Straight Track, While the City Sleeps, they're, I guess, relatively speaking, about comic book length, right? So about 30-some pages, not as long as The Great North Wood. Yeah, so the idea with the Grey Area series was to do just a series of, standalone comics. And because I was only just really starting out making comics, I think perhaps it was a mistake to tie them all together in a series, because actually, as my writing developed and improved, hopefully, I just felt like maybe that it wasn't necessary to have them all in a series. I could have just done standalone books, perhaps, but I started it as a series, so continued really. But I guess because one of my favourite comic book artists is Adrian Tomine, and his series is called Optic Nerve, and the optic nerve is like a grey area at the back of your eye where you can't see the image on your optic nerve. So I kind of nicked his idea and called it Grey Area. But it relates to the kind of overlooked landscapes and places that I quite like, the kind of grey areas in between other places in the city that people perhaps overlook. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I was wanting to ask you where the name Grey Area came from for that series. Now, I would have guessed, and I was even thinking along the lines of the latter that you mentioned, right? The kind of overlooked spaces that people who live in the area may not really notice. I had no clue about the links between your title Grey Area for this series and Tomine, and with Optic Nerve. So that's great. Yeah,
it just seemed to work quite well in both ways, and it's quite nicely ambiguous as well. So I can do what I like with it, really.
Now, are you going to continue with the Grey Area series, or have you more or less left that behind after 4 issues?
Yeah, I feel like I've probably left it behind, to be honest. I've got a few other ideas for comics planned, but I think they probably work better not being tied into a series. I think often when people, at comics fairs and things, if I'm selling 2 or 3 issues of this Grey Area series, people often say, like, where's issue 1? And I'm like, well, it's not in print anymore and I don't really want to reprint it. So it kind of puts people off, I think. But at the same time, it does kind of create a brand identity, I guess. So I'm not quite sure if I've finished with it altogether, but I think my next comic probably won't be a Grey Area comic.
Have you thought of collecting all of your Grey Area stories into one larger volume?
I have thought about it, but I don't think I'll do it because, looking back on the first one, it really was when I was kind of learning to draw in a comics way, and I cringe a bit when I look at the artwork for it. So I'm quite happy that it's out of print, and I'm happy to make it available digitally, I think, but I don't plan to print it again.
Because I was looking on your website, are those first 2 Grey Area texts available digitally?
They are actually not on my website.
Okay.
I think it might be on Comixology or something.
Okay. So if people wanted to go back and see your early work, While the City Sleeps and The Old Straight Track, they could probably find them on Comixology?
Yes. In fact, I'll add a link on my website later. And so check my website instead, because I'm not quite sure where they're available. But.
Yeah. And I'll mention that your website address is www.timothybird, and that's one word, timothybird.co.uk.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Or they can just do a search on Google, Timothy Bird Comics, and I think it comes up first.
Yep. There's not many Timothy Birds making comics. So.
Now, I want to get back to the new book, The Great North Wood, but also maybe include some questions about your Grey Area series. One of the things that I noticed in reading across your various works that I've been able to get my hands on is that, as I mentioned earlier, you have a dearth of character, but you let the narrative speak primarily through space, which is unique as a storyteller, I think. At the same time, it seems to me that in most of your narratives, at least the ones that I've read, you seem to rely on, I don't know, what would we call him or it, a surrogate observer. And yeah. I think this is most prominent in The Great North Wood, where we have in almost every single panel a fox who is observing what you as the storyteller are describing in terms of space. And in the 2 Grey Area books that I've read, From the City to the Sea and Our Town, you also have surrogates. I think for the most part in the Grey Area, it's the man with the binoculars, especially in, I guess, the last 2/3. And then in Our Town, it's, let's say, I don't know, maybe the origami woman and the man who finds her origami birds. But it's definitely apparent in The Great North Wood with the fox, who, again, is in about every single panel. And I'm wondering what you're doing with these kind of surrogate observers in your stories.
Yes, good question. I think it just helps the reader maybe to... I don't know if I should say follow the narrative or maybe create a narrative even out of a series of panels where there's no text and it's just landscapes. I think you do need a character or something to kind of hold on to and lead you through the story. I'm a bit hesitant to say story because it's not necessarily a story. So. But yeah, having that fox kind of guide you through the landscape, I guess, literally, it shows you the way. The reason I chose a fox for the Great North Woods is you have quite a big problem with urban foxes in South London. You see them everywhere, but it goes back to like quite an ancient time. I guess you would have had foxes in the woods when it was a dense wooded forest. So yeah, it's a creature that's probably been ever present in this part of South London. And then going back to the Grey Areacomics, I guess it's the same thing, just having a person guide you through the landscape. With Our Town's a bit different, because that's kind of it's more of a personal story, I guess. It's about me and my wife, really. When we got married, my wife made 1,000 paper cranes to hang in the wedding venue, which goes back to a Japanese folk tale, I think, where it's meant to bring good luck to make 1,000 paper cranes. And so the comic's kind of about imagining where these paper cranes end up and finding them throughout like our life as we get older, and see where they pop up. So there are two characters that guide you through that story, but actually it's me and my wife.
That's interesting that that's the case. I didn't even think in those terms, but that really makes sense.
I didn't make it obvious in the narrative. I left it deliberately kind of ambiguous again. I think one of the good things I think about comics is you can have a series of panels that don't really mean anything together, but people do create their own narratives from it, and that I quite like presenting people with those challenges, like present readers with panels that maybe don't naturally fit together, and then see what people make of them.
Now, one of the things that I also noticed about the Great North Wood, maybe to a lesser degree in some of the Grey Area stories, but definitely in the Great North Wood, is the fact that you're able to explore not only, let's say, so to speak, the character of a particular location, South London in particular, through your style of storytelling, but also history. I was struck by the way that sometimes within a single panel, you're able to bring the past and the present together. And I first started noticing this when, we're close to the beginning and we're introduced to the fox. And the fox is in, obviously, a modern South London, and he's, in the city. He's eating, I guess, some leftover chicken that has been left over. It's on the street. And then we see him move from this urban space eating the chicken to a wooded area. I mean, he doesn't move, but the background changes from one panel to the next, and he's still eating this chicken. And so there's that link to the contemporary, but he's been transported back to the past. And you do this a lot in the Great North Wood, that you juxtaposed past and present at times to show some kind of almost connectedness or a continuum.
Yeah. So at the start of the book, the fox hops over a wall, and he's gone, you're quite right, from modern day London to the last ice age, I guess. Because he says, long ago, this was all just rock and ice. Mm-hmm. And he walks across this kind of icy page, and then he ends up in the woods. So it's gone, I don't know how long that is, tens of thousands of years, I guess, in the gap between two panels. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what interests me about places, really, that they have continued to exist for thousands and millions of years, and will continue to do so. And people, they're just passing through and writing their own stories on these places, but really it's the place that sticks around for a long time. And I guess towards the end of the book, that kind of becomes apparent again, because I go into the future when there are no people, and all these settings reappear, but they're overgrown with trees and weeds or whatever. And like the place lives on, even though, people maybe don't occupy it anymore.
Right. That's the chapter, A Forest Again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I tell you, one of the things it reminded me of reading The Great North Wood is, at least to some degree, I mean, you're doing something very different, but it nonetheless reminded me of Richard Maguire's Here.
Yeah. That's a great book. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly how that the place is always there, and it's just different characters reappearing and just having their brief moment.
Did you have Here in mind when you were creating your own kind of historical fluidity?
Probably not consciously, but I guess it was definitely there unconsciously. Yeah.
Because I think that the way that you handled the story is a great way of exploring history, mixing the past and the present in such a way.
Yeah, and I'm just really interested in history and local history in particular. So I really enjoy doing all the research for these books and reading up about the local history, and London is packed with history, really. So it's great to do all this reading and then try and fit it into my comics as well.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, The Great North Wood is the longest narrative that you've created. Is that correct?
Yeah. The Grey Areacomics, none of them went over 30 pages. So, yeah, it's sort of double the length of any of those. I think it's 68 pages, which it's not like a really long graphic novel, but it felt like it took me quite a long time to create it and draw it.
You're right. I mean, there aren't that many pages, 68, which is probably, twice as long as your individual Grey Area comics. On the other hand, I did get a sense of reading The Great North Wood that this is quite a substantive story, right? So even though there may not be, over 100 or 150 pages, there's still something really solid about the narrative. And it didn't seem as short as it was.
Yeah. I do try and pack quite a lot into each page. So there's sort of 12 panels on most pages. So it does, I guess it does feel quite like I feel like there's probably a lot going on in each page and in each chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you enjoy writing in a longer form? And then a follow-up question to that is, do you plan on writing in an even longer form from The Great North Wood? Because you've done quite a bit of anthology work. Your Grey Areacomics, as you mentioned, are 30-some pages. You kind of doubled that with The Great North Wood. Do you have kind of a long-form narrative in mind?
Not really at the minute. And I think even though The Great North Wood is longer, it's all divided up into quite short chapters, and so I think I work quite well with these short chapters, and it's maybe just putting them together a bit to create a longer work. But I haven't really planned to do anything on that scale again. I think the comic I'm thinking of making next will be quite short, so probably back to sort of the floppy comic kind of format.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, or another question regarding The Great North Wood, is there is a page, or at least the dialogue on the page, where there is repetition, and I see this at the very beginning of The Great North Wood in that first chapter, in Ancient Forest, and then we see it again toward the very end, and it's where you write, "Tales are told of those who walk amongst the trees. Hunters and travelers leaving their villages behind, looking for food and shelter, wary of the wolves and wild boar. Delving deeper into the dark, into the unknown, eyes watching from the shadows. Strange spirits leading the wanderers down paths they've never seen before, to unfamiliar places, searching endlessly for a path home." You repeat the exact same, I guess if you want to call it voiceover or narrative text at the very end, although with one exception, with entirely different pictures. And that one exception is the panel where you write, eyes watching from the shadows. There's this image of a chicken that I guess is apparently from the box that the fox is eating the chicken from. Other than that, though, the images are different, but the text is the same. So I'm curious about your embedding that exact same text at the beginning and the end of The Great North Wood.
Yeah. I guess I quite like writing things quite lyrically and trying to make it sound a bit poetic. So, having that repetition, I think just it kind of makes the writing, pushes the writing to the front a bit. But it's so at the end when the comic kind of goes into the future and becomes this place that's where there are no people anymore, and that's where I repeat these phrases. So it's the idea of not knowing who the travellers are at that point, and perhaps it's nature kind of taking over and looking for a home again amongst the ruined buildings that mankind has left behind. So it's kind of changing perspective a bit, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and what you just described reminds me of, and it's been so long since I've read this, but there's a particular scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace where after a big devastating battle between the French and the Russians, the narrator basically speculates about how on this battlefield where the men have more or less decimated the natural landscape, over time, nature will build back up the trees, the grass, the bushes, and overtake, if not cover up entirely, to a point almost of being forgotten, the individuals who died in that battle. And there's this sense of nature triumphing despite what humans have done to it. And so I get the same sense toward the end of The Great North Wood.
Yeah, that was definitely the idea I was going for. I've never read War and Peace, so I'm just thinking along the same lines as Tolstoy. But I don't know. I read an article in a science journal, New Scientist. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if you get that.
No. Well, we may, but I don't read it. No.
No. But it was just sort of speculating how long it would take for nature to kind of reclaim the city, if there were no people here. And the conclusion was sort of surprisingly short. Once people stopped maintaining roads and buildings, trees and wildlife will quite rapidly overtake them and be able to grow through the tarmac. And it just that kind of stuck with me, that actually nature would be able to reclaim a town or a city within a few decades perhaps. And it just surprised me that it would be so quick.
Now, I want to ask you a few questions about your work with anthologies. Now, you have contributed pieces to an anthology that Avery Hill puts out, Reads, and I think you've contributed to issues 1 through 4 of the, I guess what's called the second volume of Reads. And I think we even discussed all 4 of those issues on an Avery Hill spotlight that we did a couple of years ago. But you've contributed to other anthologies as well. Broken Frontier Yearbook, Dead Singer Society, Dirty Rotten Comics, Over the Line, A Bit of Undigested Potato, Off Life, and then Tiny Dancing. What is it about anthology work that apparently draws you?
I find it really useful for trying out new ideas and even for using new materials and just experimenting with things. So it's, for me, for a creator, I think it's a really useful way of, it's almost like keeping a sketchbook, I guess, but then just being able to show lots of people and get feedback on it. So it's, with the Reeds one that you mentioned was interesting because that was the only time I've ever illustrated a comic that someone else has written. I drew Ricky Miller's Hitchcock comic. Mm-hmm. So he'd written the script and I illustrated it in that anthology. So that was an interesting experience. But most of the time, I like contributing to anthologies because I feel like it contributes to the comics community as well, and it's a good way of just trying out ideas in quite a public way. But I think anthologies are great as well for readers because it's a great way to just discover quite a diverse range of writers in a fairly accessible format.
Do you feel that, let's say, at least compared to the 1980s and even into the 1990s, that the anthology format in terms of comics has, if not fallen by the wayside, then at least doesn't get the attention that it once did?
I don't know, to be honest. I didn't really come to comics until fairly recently. So I wasn't really reading comics in the 80s and 90s. Probably around 2008 or 9, I started making comics and became aware of the comics scene. And there seemed to be a lot of really good anthologies at that point. But yeah, I'm not sure about the 80s and 90s.
What's the anthology market like in the UK right now, from your perspective?
I guess there's a handful of quite interesting ones. I mean, you mentioned the Broken Frontier Yearbook, which comes out once a year, and that's quite an interesting collection of things. And there's another good one called Dirty Rotten Comics. They do some. They've got their values are quite good because they try and promote writers who haven't been published elsewhere. So I think it's in terms of like the small press and kind of market, anthologies are doing really well. I'm not sure in a more kind of professional manner. Perhaps they're not such a big seller anymore. I don't know.
Now, in 2015, you won the British Comics Award for Grey Area from the City to the Sea. Was there, and by the way, congratulations on that. Did you notice any change or increase in the attention to your comics after that award? Yeah, it was a massive surprise, to be honest, winning the awards, because my comics are always like a bit strange, and I didn't think they'd win like a really big award, because the other comics that were nominated alongside it were, I guess, a lot more mainstream and professionally produced and stuff. So it was really surprising to even have been nominated for it. And then when I won the award, it was a real shock. And for me, it sort of meant it kind of validated what I was doing, and made me think that what people liked my comics. So that was a really great feeling. And then afterwards, I definitely seemed to get more attention in what I was doing, and on comics review sites definitely picked up on From the City to the Sea. But then it kind of made me feel a bit unsure about where to go next. And then the follow-up to From the City to the Sea was Our Town, Grey Area, Our Town. And I just felt like I struggled a bit with that, because I felt a bit under pressure, I suppose, having won a big award. So it's probably taken me a few years to feel like I can just get back into enjoying making comics again. But yeah, it's great because people do seem to be aware of my work now. So it's been a massive boost for me. Yeah. So on the one hand, it was, as you put it, a boost. on the other, it became somewhat of a burden having won that award because you felt like, you had to live up to it?
Perhaps, yeah, maybe a burden's a bit too strong, but it was just such a surprise to win that I felt like, are people going to expect a certain standard of comics from me now? And strange. It's strange. I've always been the sort of person that kind of struggles to accept praise and things anyway. So I've always been, just quite modest with my comics. So it was just an unusual feeling to be told these people thought my comics were the best.
You've been with Avery Hill for a number of years. Now, my own experience with Avery Hill, I don't think that I knew that Avery Hill existed until about 3 years ago. And somehow I got word that Avery Hill was publishing Tilly Walden's very first book. And I actually did interview Tilly for the show, and that's how I discovered Avery Hill Publishing. It had been around for a while, but it really didn't have any U.S. exposure. I think a year later or so, they got Retrofit Big Planet to distribute their comics in the U.S., which was really good. Now I'm very much aware of Avery Hill as a publisher, and I really enjoy the kind of things that they do, including your work. And I'm wondering how you came to connect with Avery Hill. How did Avery Hill become your publisher?
It goes back quite a long way. I was in my 20s, I guess, when I started drawing comics, or trying to draw them properly, if you like. And I was looking for anthologies that would publish my comics, because they were all kind of just 1 or 2 pages long. Mm-hmm. And I came across Tiny Dancing in a comic book shop, and it was more of a zine, I guess, than a comic anthology, because it contained poetry and illustrations and comics and all sorts. But I felt like that would be a good fit for my early attempts at drawing comics, and fortunately they included one of my first comic in there in Tiny Dancing, and then it was just a sort of like a series of fortunate events. It turned out they lived round the corner, more or less, from where I was living at the time, and so it just kind of fell into place that I continued to do my comics through them, really. So when I was doing the first Grey Area comic, they were looking to expand their publishing output from just doing zines and anthologies to doing full-length comics. So that just came at a great time again. And so, I've just worked with them for a few years now, And their publishing has just gone from strength to strength, really. Mm-hmm. Some really great comics, and being able to work with Tilly Walden, who you mentioned, has been really great for them, because her book just really took off and has been very successful for them, really. So it's put them on the map, I guess you could say. It's a comics publisher.
Mm-hmm. And, I think one of the individuals who's been so instrumental in introducing me to the kind of stuff that Avery Hill has been doing over the past few years is Kat Chapman, who, is someone who connected us for this interview. So I want to thank her for that. And she also has her own book that's going to be coming out later this year from Avery Hill, Follow Me In.
Yeah, so that will come out in 2 weeks' time in the UK anyway, at Thought Bubble, which is a big comics fair in Leeds in the UK. Mm-hmm. And I'm really looking forward to reading her book. From what I've seen of it so far, it looks amazing. Her artwork is just beautiful. So really looking forward to reading that. She sent me a preview copy of it, but I haven't read it because I'm waiting to get the proper print version, because it looks like a really nice kind of hardback big, hefty book. So I think it'd be a nice thing to have.
Have you read her mini comic series, Catscene?
Yeah, a few of them, not all of them, I have to admit, but yeah, they're great. I'm a big fan of kind of autobiographical diary comics and stuff, and she's got a really nice way of writing them, and her artwork's just really lovely.
It is, and in fact, we looked on an episode last year of the podcast. We looked at least up until that point, all of the issues of Catscene that she had published, and quite impressive. And it was around that time that she was also telling me about this new book that's going to be coming out in the not too distant future. I guess sooner than it's going to be coming out here over in the UK.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to having her on the show to talk about her new book.
Yeah. I'm sure it'll be a great book. And so she's been with Avery Hill Publishing for a couple of years, working as I guess doing more, like the marketing side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
She's I guess my lifeline into whatever Avery Hill is doing, and which is how I discovered the Great North Wood.
Yeah.
So, Tim, what are you working on now that you can tell us about?
Well, nothing really. It's been quite a while since I finished the Great North Wood. I finished it around March time, and I feel like I've just had a big break from drawing, which wasn't really intentional. But I guess I was looking after my kids over the summer holidays, so just my time for drawing seemed to diminish a lot, and I just got out of the habit of it really. Because, so I'm a stay-at-home dad. I look after my kids full time, and I just think of my comics really as a sort of a hobby, really. So I just try and work on them when I've really got the motivation to do it. But I do have an idea for the next one, and it's going to be probably about motorways. So, big roads in the UK. I guess, do you call them motorways in America?
Highways.
Highways,
yeah.
Right. And I just remember kind of falling asleep in the back of a car, like when my parents were driving, particularly in the winter time for some reason, and just that felt like quite a magical time, kind of just watching the lights of the other cars and the street lights kind of zooming past. So I'm going to try and do a comic that captures that feeling.
Yeah. In the London area or in the UK in general, are you doing anything to publicize the Great North Wood?
Yeah, I've been doing quite a bit actually. It's just yesterday, in fact, the Sydenham Hill Woods, which is the as I mentioned before, the last kind of big area of the Great North Wood, had a open day. So I was there with my book talking to people about the Great North Woods. Mm-hmm. And it's been picked up by kind of the local newspapers and things, which has been great. And it's quite nice that people sort of outside the usual comics world seem to be interested in it, because a lot of the time it does feel like you're just, selling comics to other people who make comics. So it's nice to reach a new audience, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm.
Now, The Great North Wood was released the very beginning of September here in the United States. When did it come out in the UK?
It came out at the East London Comics Art Fair, which was in June.
Oh, okay.
So a couple of months earlier. But yeah, so I finished drawing it around April. And so, yeah, I feel like I can look back on it now and be a bit more, what's the word? I can like it now. I think when I first finished it, I just didn't want to look at it for quite a long time.
Just because you'd been so enmeshed in it for so long?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that about most things I create. I just like to finish it and forget about it for a while.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that our listeners check out The Great North Wood. They can get it here in the United States, among other places, at sites like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's a fascinating read, and I have to say it's been really nice talking with you, Tim, on the podcast about The Great North Wood, as well as some of your earlier work.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again to Tim Bird for taking the time to talk with me for the podcast. His new book, The Great North Wood, was just released by Avery Hill Publishing, and I enthusiastically recommend that you get a copy and experience the unique form of storytelling in which Tim engages. And if you want to find great prices on a variety of other comics, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find unbeatable prices on a variety of titles, including new works coming out from Avery Hill Publishing. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Tim Bird. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can contact us on social media as well. We're all over the place. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Podcasts. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. This was a fun interview with Tim Bird, and I have more conversations lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.